Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Sarah Parks. I am the program manager for the Missouri Association for Museums and Archives. And today we have a special presentation for you from the Northeast Document Conservation Center. And Stephanie will be joining us. A few little housekeeping things before I turn it over to her. We are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation. So if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat as we talk, she and I will be monitoring that. We will probably have enough time at the end of the session also to take questions then.
Please come to the front desk.
And then a couple other little smaller things. You will be getting, after the presentation, a couple different handouts from Stephanie. A link to a survey with NEDCC about this program, and then the recording to today's session. So I will go ahead and get Stephanie introduced and then hand over the presentation to her. So Stephanie is an associate preservation specialist at NEDCC, where she provides preservation information and outreach, including assessments, consultations, training programs, and disaster assistance for cultural heritage organizations of all types. She has worked as a cultural heritage professional for about 13 years, with particular interest in preservation, collections management, and aiding institutions through periods of growth and change. She holds a BA in political science from Boston University and an MA in museum studies from Harvard University Extension School. So please welcome Stephanie, and we will go ahead and let her take the presentation from here.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. I am excited to be here, and I'm just going to share my slides, and then we'll be able to dive in. All right. So that should be showing up for everyone. If you don't see it, let me know in chat. But otherwise, okay, good, perfect. So hi all. As Sarah said, I am an associate preservation specialist for NEDCC, and I believe in this series you've already heard a little bit about the center, so I'm not going to go into that too much, although if you have additional questions about it, I'm happy to answer those at the end. And for today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on exhibiting collections and talking about some good practices. I'm going to go through quite a few resources during this presentation as well. So Sarah already mentioned that y'all will be receiving some follow-up handouts, and one of those does include a consolidated list of the things that I'll be talking about. So don't feel like you have to try to capture all of that immediately. You will have future reference available to you as well. So this is an overview of what we'll be covering today. We're going to start with a discussion of some of the common risks that are inherent to exhibiting collections. And that's not necessarily meant to deter you from exhibiting materials, but to introduce you to these risks so that you can better protect your collections when they are on view. We are also going to discuss policies and guidelines as they relate to exhibitions. And so that includes things like an exhibit policy, also things like your donor agreements, any borrower and loan agreements and logistics, condition reporting, and security. After that, we'll discuss considerations that guide the selection of materials for exhibition. And then finally, we will talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of getting physical spaces in good shape for exhibition. And that means we'll take a look at factors like light, environmental conditions, and air quality, as well as considerations that guide best practices for exhibit and display. So things like proper art and object handling and display methods themselves. Successful exhibitions tell compelling stories. They connect our viewers through objects and text and other resources, and they can be really great ways of providing outreach and advocacy for the value of our collection. And that's the case regardless of what type of institution you are at. With museums, though, in particular, exhibition is a really primary driving force. It is often highlighted directly within a museum's mission statement, and political pressures can sometimes bear heavily on exhibit choices as well. The ultimate goal is always going to be to convey a concept and to connect with our viewers. But there are many steps that lead to the creation of an exhibit, and the content is not actually the sole consideration when developing an exhibition. The need to exhibit collections materials complicates our preservation because materials displayed have, almost by definition, special value, and exhibition poses several preservation and conservation risks. So when we think about it that way, exhibition is by nature at odds with preservation. And that's why some time has to be spent well before the exhibit goes up, weighing our risks, evaluating the needs of the collection's objects, identifying concerns, and taking steps to mitigate those issues. So we really want to strive to balance our preservation and our access. So if we consider what those display risks are, light is going to be one of the biggest risks to collections materials that are put on view. There is a really excellent, if perhaps somewhat extreme example of the sort of damage light can cause that was articulated and discussed in really great detail in a Boston Globe article from 2014 that describes the Mark Rothko murals at Harvard University. So these were on display from 1964 through 1979 in an area that had constant exposure to sunlight. And they became extremely damaged, as you can see in the photo here, so damaged that they were actually packed away for 35 years. So eventually, an international team of conservators used precision tinted light to correct for color loss. This was a really expensive process, and again, it's perhaps a more extreme example, but it really speaks to the sort of damage, which is often irreversible, that light can do to our materials if they are on view for longer than is actually safe for them. Proper lighting conditions is something that we are going to discuss a bit later in this webinar, but for the moment, we're just going to talk about our basic threats to our collection. And again, just to link back to that idea of having a resource handout, I have included a couple articles on the Rothko murals within that handout. So if it is something that you'd like to learn a little bit more about, including the treatment process, which is a really, really interesting conservation treatment, you'll have some options available for you. So there are certain broad environmental causes of damage. However, we ourselves can also inadvertently cause problems through the use and handling of our collections, and that can result in mechanical damage. We have some examples on screen here. So on the left, you can see the pinning of an original photograph. And then on the right, we have a book that is opened at a 180-degree angle, which is actually really bad for the spine. And I'm just moving my mouse over. You can actually already see, this isn't even a great photo, but you can see some of the damage that's already occurred to that bound volume. Materials are often framed prior to display, and acidic matting materials can interact with our original collections items to cause really serious chemical damage. You can see examples of this type of damage on screen, where we have speckled foxing under the mat area and under the area where the frame would have come in contact with this material. You can also see matte burn around the image too. And just as a refresher for anyone who's not familiar with the term foxing, that's describing small brown spots that appear on paper. They are most likely caused by mold or by the presence of tiny metal particles in the paper. There's a little bit of debate actually around exactly what causes them. But when that occurs, that's in conjunction with high humidity and temperature. And then when we look a little bit closer at the actual matte burn, that is going to be typically caused by acid migration, where there are better quality papers that are being stained by poor quality papers stored with them. So in this case, we're saying that the mat itself was acidic and causing that damage. While not as frequent as the display chemical and mechanical risks we just discussed, theft and vandalism are also risks that are associated with exhibition. The image that you see on the left is from the very famous theft at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, where there were 13 high-value works that were stolen in 1990, and they still have not been recovered. And security really is always a risk for any items that are on view. Again, the Gardner story is a really interesting one. The museum is still offering a $10 million reward for information leading to the restitution of those works. I definitely included a couple links about the Gardner within that resource document. There's also a really interesting 2021 Netflix documentary on this. I believe it was called This Is a Robbery. So y'all can certainly look into that as well. But even if this is, again, maybe a bit of a more extreme example, theft is something that does unfortunately occur even at our smaller institutions, even where perhaps we don't necessarily feel that we have works of quite as high value as, say, the Gardner does. There are still people who unfortunately will sometimes take things when they are on display and more easy to get to. And of course, vandalism is another related security threat. So on the right, what you're actually looking at is a Monet at the National Gallery of Ireland that a visitor punched, and you can see the damage that was done to the canvas there. So the point with all of this is that exhibition is inherently risky for collections. And if we're making the decision to exhibit, we need to take time to weigh these risks and to think about steps that will allow us to mitigate our potential issues. Having policies around exhibition and around security in particular are going to be the underpinnings of really good practice. Are there any questions about these risks before we continue? All right, I don't see anything popping up in chat, but I'll continue to keep my eye on that as we move forward. So we are going to turn our attention to policies next, which are really helpful in staving off some of the damage and threats that I just mentioned. Establishing written policies and procedures helps to clarify goals, needs, and expectations for any exhibition project. As the foundation of a responsible exhibition program, good policy ensures the display of our collections according to best practices, institutional needs, and professional guidelines. Good policy explains your expectations and helps to protect collections from harm. It also provides a rationale for choosing to display or not to display certain items. Good policy is an advocacy tool, a guiding document, and in a way, it can be an acknowledgement of risk. So let's take a look at what can actually go into our policies. Here on screen, you can see some specific areas that you may want to address in one or several policy documents. The way that you break these out is really up to you, and it may be determined by the size and the mission of your organization. It should be noted that many of these policy areas overlap with those that are related to things like collections management and emergency preparedness. So you may be able to cull information from existing documentation as you work towards a comprehensive exhibition policy. Now, that's if you have those other guiding documents. If not, this is a really good moment for me to plug the importance of having written policies in general, particularly when it comes to holistic or total collections care. So some of the questions that you might want to ask when creating or reviewing an exhibit policy include, how long do exhibits stay up? Or how long does this particular exhibit stay up? It may be helpful to establish maximum guidelines and acknowledge that some items may require reassessment or more limited display. Consider who selects the materials being exhibited. Hopefully this is someone who is intimately aware of the collection's items and their needs, like a curator. If conservation treatment is needed before or after an exhibit, who is responsible for that treatment? This is when you want to consider in a few different ways, and that financial obligation associated with treatment is especially important to consider. Think about what is an acceptable environment for exhibiting loaned materials. Do you even have an acceptable environment for exhibition, both for your collections and for any borrowed items? What type of security is available to protect items? Are there specifications for label design or for case layout? And what is your policy on loaning materials to other institutions? All of these come together to help form that exhibit policy and guidelines. We're going to continue talking about this, but I will point out as well, we have an image from an institution that shall remain nameless, but you can see that they have materials on display right at the very front of their building. And this is very problematic due to the light exposure. You can see those really big windows that are just letting light in on all of those collections items. There are also security risks that present themselves with this particular location. So it's an image that we've included, but it's not necessarily one where we're recommending that you try to implement anything similar at your own institution. Now, you may not need to address every aspect of exhibition in your policy, and there may be other aspects that you want to cover depending upon your particular institution, the collections you work with, and the audience that you serve. But the questions that I was providing as prompts and the contents lists that are on screen, these are all really things that you can use as a starting point, and you can tailor them further to suit your institution. It's also really helpful to use your network of peer organizations and take a look at what they've done to help guide some of your choices. The University of Washington Libraries exhibit policy is a really nice place to start. So that is what is linked on screen. There's also some really wonderful resources that have been consolidated by the American Alliance of Museums. If you're an individual or an institutional member, you have access to their resource library as well as to their forums. And you likely have other peer networks in your area and nationally that you can tap into as you explore options and as you tailor your policies. Policy becomes especially important if you are borrowing or lending items, because that sets really clear expectations for all parties involved in that process. You absolutely need to have a written loan policy and loan procedures as well as a loan agreement form. So we're going to take a look at those in a little bit more detail. If you are asking to borrow an item, make sure that you're ready to supply the following to the institution that owns the item in question. Starting with some basics, you should be able to tell them exactly who you are and provide a clear contact. You'll want to have the title, the location, and the dates of the exhibit itself. Details of the item to be borrowed, including any call number that might be associated with it or other appropriate types of collections metadata. Specifics of the items that is going to be on exhibit. So an example here would be with bound volumes. If there is a specific page that you want to display, you should be able to tell the institution that. You'll want to provide a full facilities report and details about the exhibit space, including your environmental standards for that space. You certainly need to be able to provide clear insurance coverage for the item on loan and any information about catalogs, and that includes web versions of exhibition information, any other associated publicity. All of that will need to be cleared with the institution as well, because of course that can relate very directly to copyright restrictions and things like that for these materials. Now that's a starting list. Again, there can be other considerations that are specific to the institutions and organizations that you might be dealing with and that I may not have listed here. An example would be the National Archives actually has very explicit borrowing guidelines for use of their materials. And that is readily available on their website to take a look at their technical guidelines and specifications. Now, on the flip side, if you anticipate requests to borrow your materials or have a request to borrow a specific item, you want to make sure that you can provide the requester with the costs that would be associated with that loan. You certainly want to provide a condition report for the item. You should be able to share any conservation work that's occurred prior to the loan. Provide specific environmental standards that you want the institution to maintain within their exhibit space. Discuss security requirements with that organization. If there are specific amounts or other housing requests that you have that might relate to how it's being shown on exhibits, so things like book cradles and other supports and mounts, you should likely be able to provide that to the institution, or at least provide that request and make sure they know exactly how you would like these materials to be displayed. And of course, logistics that relate to the item actually traveling to and from the exhibit space. You are going to be the person who knows your collections best, and you're going to know what's safe for an item. So it's really important to be able to articulate these things and be in good communication with the person requesting to borrow an item. And of course, hopefully you will have your exhibition policies in place prior to someone asking for an item, because that will help you to justify your decisions to either loan or not to loan. You know, you are fully within your right to refuse to loan materials. That is part of what responsible collection stewardship looks like sometimes. If you are loaning, definitely think about the value of the item to your institution and consider what loss or damage to it might mean. Now, this is sort of a broad topic, so I have included some example policies on the resource list so you all can see how these are articulated by real institutions. But we do have an example here as well for our Acme Museum, talking about bound materials. So when we think about exhibit requirements, they can be pretty exacting depending upon the institution. In this case, we're saying this museum requires that books are displayed flat as opposed to at a rake or tilt. If a tilt is required by exhibit cases, the maximum allowed will be a 15-degree angle with adequate support for the text block. Cradles will be constructed out of black mat provided by Acme Museum. If acrylic cradles are requested, they have to be delivered to the lending institution prior to exhibition so that a fit test can be conducted. Acme Museum objects will be installed by Acme Museum staff, and Acme Museum will deinstall loaned items. So again, this can seem perhaps like a long list of requests, but this really is realistic for what a lot of institutions require. Now, as part of your loan decision and during the entirety of the exhibition process, you want to ensure that condition reporting is occurring on a routine basis so that you can evaluate conditions and ensure that the object is safe. So when we talk about condition reporting, we want to make sure that we're inspecting all parts of the item before display. And so if there are any existing issues that are discovered with its physical appearance, that needs to be documented. If any of those issues actually pose problems for display, then they need to be addressed before exhibit occurs. And you need to continue to routinely examine the materials during exhibit, because this allows you to catch any issues that are occurring early on. For instance, if something proves to be more light sensitive than you're expecting, you need to catch that early on. After exhibit, we want to do another condition report. We need to think about whether our object needs conservation to treat any problems that could have occurred during exhibition. In conjunction with this, we need to consider if this material actually can be exhibited again. Maybe it, again, proved less stable, and maybe it's not really a good fit for display. We can also do some evaluating regarding our method of display. Maybe there are things that we could do next time that would better support our material. And make sure that you are documenting all of this information. We really want things to be written down. And with condition reporting, if you have the ability to document via photograph, that is even better. So doing a combination is really going to be the best case here. So this is a couple little screen grabs from a checklist template. It's a spreadsheet that Harvard University created for its exhibitions and loans program, and it's freely available online. And this is a fillable Excel spreadsheet that you can use to capture information that's relevant to identification, display, condition, treatment, preparation, and installation of each item that is going to be included in an exhibition. Typically, the left-hand side of the template is completed by the, well, in this case, the library at Harvard that really developed this. And then the right-hand side is completed by conservation. But each side of that can really be customized to meet the needs of your institution and the needs of any specific exhibitions and loans. So this is a tool that you can take a look at and adapt to perhaps serve as a model for your own institution as well. So we're going to talk about selecting materials for exhibition next. And our exhibition policies that we've written will help to guide decisions for appropriate use both in-house and off-site. And all of that ultimately helps you with the selection of materials. Aside from selection that is based on exhibition policy, you also want to know that you actually have the right to exhibit the materials that you hold, and that you're choosing items for display wisely and with appropriate regard to the exhibit space limitations and to any limitations that are inherent to the collections items. Donor agreement forms are really important for determining this. And if your institution does not have one or doesn't use it consistently with new accessions, then I highly encourage you to improve upon that practice. You want to see if your donor forms address exhibition of donated materials, or perhaps it addresses not exhibiting donor materials so that you are mediating donor expectations. Because sometimes folks will donate and really expect that their items might be on extremely frequent display. And just to add another layer of complication, it's nice to also think about what those forms say about digital exhibition. That's something that not as many people cover, but that is also a really important practice to address. So here we have a fairly typical statement about donations and exhibiting. And so this is: the museum cannot guarantee that any objects or documents donated to its collection will be exhibited unless expressly collected for that purpose. Only a small fraction of the collection is on view at any given time. Documents are typically made accessible for research purposes in the research center. However, the museum does allocate a significant portion of its annual budget to maintaining optimal conditions in its storage areas and galleries to ensure the long-term preservation of all collections materials. Objects from the collection are occasionally loaned to other institutions for temporary exhibitions, and many artifacts and documents in the collection are made available for research purposes. So this is covering quite a few bases, and having this information documented is really pretty critical. When you are considering an item for exhibit, you want to ask these sorts of questions. Can the item withstand exhibition? What is the item's exhibit history? Is the item damaged? If so, is conservation treatment needed? Is the media stable? How light sensitive is it? Are special environmental or security protections needed? Is the item difficult to mount? And does the item have physical limitations? You want to use these to guide your considerations and to set time limits for sensitive items, ensure that you are rotating sensitive objects or using facsimiles, and really being mindful of the needs of the collections. So an example here, again, if we're thinking about bound volumes, we only want to open a binding as far as that binding is going to allow. You never want to force something open further. You want to consider about the value that's added in display as well. You're not necessarily just pulling all of the prettiest things to put on display. And of course, the exhibition can be a really powerful motivator for conservation work. So making sure that materials really can stand up to exhibition. On screen, we have the example of an illuminated manuscript. So if we were considering what this item really needs for safe display, we'd start by thinking about how it's been created. So that might seem relatively simple at first, right? We're talking about a bound volume. But there's a lot of materials in there. We have either parchment or paper leaves. There's likely to be wood boards, leather, or textile covers. You're going to have various inks, paints, and metals. When it comes to the calligraphy and the illuminations themselves, those inks and pigments or paints, as well as the metals, they're going to sit on the surface. And they're going to expand and contract at different rates. So we need to be mindful of that. This is another example where it is a bound material. So if we're trying to show the actual content, we need to be able to open it safely and support it appropriately. And so when we think about all those factors, as well as the age that an illuminated manuscript will inherently have, plus that mixed media-ness, and the fact that it is a book, all of that comes together to pose issues that have to be addressed before you're going to place it on view for any amount of time. The duration of an item on view is also something that you want to think about. So if you are looking at permanent versus temporary exhibits, we have some guidance on screen for things to consider. It's almost a little bit like a pro and con list for each of these. With permanent exhibits, frequently you see either the most valuable or the least valuable that are commonly exhibited. Items can develop issues for being on display for a long period of time. So things like sagging, or if we're thinking about bound materials, and a preference for opening at a certain page can occur. Things like photographs and fabrics and other materials are going to be really susceptible to light damage, and we will circle back to that in a little bit. With temporary exhibits, we still need to account for the fact that damage is accumulated over time. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to limit the length of time that things are displayed. We may need to develop rotation schedules as well for more sensitive items. You absolutely need to have a record that discusses the exhibition and length of time that each item was displayed for, because this damage that we're talking about, it can be really cumulative. So not just in a singular exhibit, but if we want to display it again in the future, we still need to be mindful of how long and how frequently it was displayed in the past. And of course, damage can happen during deinstallation as well as installation. So being really mindful of those good handling practices is important with these types as well. Our exhibited materials will inhabit several spaces. They typically start in storage, then move to an exhibition prep area, then enter the exhibit space, and then they might be in cases or frames before they finally move back into storage. With our prep spaces, there are some considerations to take into account, including if it is easy to move around in that space. We need to think about whether our cases and frames and things like that can easily be navigated through the space as well. We want to really spend some time considering the effects of environmental conditions. So things like the light sources, temperature and relative humidity, how stable those are, how well they can be controlled in the space. We want to consider what the air quality is like in our space, if all of these things can be monitored, if the space itself can be monitored, or if it's really isolated, and if we have adequate security present. Because works of art and cultural artifacts are meant to be seen, guidelines for limiting exposure are necessary. But it is important to realize that all light is damaging. And because light damage is cumulative, even low levels can degrade paper if the exposure is long enough. The higher the light levels, the greater the potential danger. Sources that are rich in ultraviolet radiation, so UV radiation, those are going to be especially hazardous as well. So here we have some recommendations regarding light levels for different types of material when they're on display. This was adapted from a couple different resources from the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History, both of which are linked in the resources document. But if we take a look here, we can see that we have materials that are being ranked from sensitive to less sensitive and least sensitive. And for each of these categories, there are guidelines regarding the visible light and the ultraviolet light. So sensitive collections are going to include things like textiles, watercolors, photographs, and really most other paper-based materials. When we start thinking about things that are less sensitive, that'll include oil paintings and wooden objects. Typically leather goods will fall under this category as well. And our least sensitive collections will include most metals. They'll include ceramics, stones, and glass. Now, there is still some variability within this. This is a little generalized. A quick example, if we're thinking about ceramics, something that is a really high fired ceramic like porcelain is going to be a much more resistant material in general, and much more resilient as well than something that was super low fired or is earthenware, or if we're thinking about archaeological collections, things like that, you know, there can still be quite a bit of variability that needs to be taken into account. But in general, this is a good guideline to at least take a look at to get a sense of where specific materials are going to fall regarding their sensitivity to light. If you are exhibiting mixed collections, you want to make sure that you're choosing the recommended light levels for the most sensitive artifacts on display. When you have more sophisticated lighting systems, you may have a little bit more leeway with this, but typically bright lighting in one case is still going to spill over to nearby spaces. And so you really need to be mindful of that. And the same thing applies for composite objects. If you have something that is a mix of, say, textiles and wood, we really need to make sure that we are providing conditions that are safe for the more sensitive material, in this case, the textile. If you look at that first category for sensitive, I want to highlight that there's a limit of 50,000 lux hours per year that's been suggested for very light sensitive materials. We can calculate lux hours by multiplying the level of light, so numerically expressed in lux, by the hours that the object is exposed to that light. So if you have an object and it's being lit for 10 hours a day at 50 lux, as is suggested in that first section of the chart, then we reach our limit of 50,000 lux hours within 100 days. If you're displaying something at 100 lux, then that limit is going to be reached in 50 days. So the higher the light level, the shorter the exposure time will ultimately be. And keeping an exposure history for valuable or light sensitive materials should absolutely be a priority if the original object has to be shown. Again, in some cases, if we're talking about something extremely light sensitive, you may be able to show a facsimile instead, depending on the purpose of how it's being displayed and why it's being displayed. I think last aside for this slide, a room that is lit at 50 lux can seem pretty dim at first. This is about the level of a home living room in the evening. And so for someone who is coming inside on a really bright sunny day, that can feel like a very abrupt change. Good lighting design can help a great deal to ease that transition though. And actually designating a transitional space for eyes to adjust is helpful as well. And including things like signs that explain the reason for lower light levels to visitors, that's also helpful in just getting them on board and understanding how this plays a part in preservation. So we want to think about mitigating our light damage. And to a certain extent, we have the lighting situations that we have. For example, a historic house museum is going to have windows, most likely in all of its spaces, as well as plenty of other quirks, rather than having a space that was designed with exhibition in mind. So what can we do to understand our conditions and to keep them within the appropriate ranges? Well, we can avoid things like natural sunlight, whether that's direct or indirect. We can avoid incandescent lights, particularly inside cases, and halogen lighting. We can limit things like UV exposure. So adding UV filtering sleeves or film to any existing UV lights can be really helpful. You can add filtering plexiglass in cases and even on windows themselves. You can switch to things that don't emit UV. So LED lighting is a great option here. And we can limit our overall exposure too. So we can use things like timers and motion sensors so that the lights don't have to actually be on all the time, particularly if visitors aren't in the space. With really sensitive items, we might fully block light with fabric. And again, sometimes we can use facsimiles when that is reasonable. It is really important to check light levels in your exhibition spaces before installing collections and to monitor throughout the duration of your exhibit. Blue Scales textile fading cards are a standard method of testing for the effects of light on paintings, textiles, and documents that are on display. The way these work is that you have 8 pieces of wool cloth that have been tinted with blue dyes of varying but measured degrees of light fastness, and those are all mounted onto a card. So to use them, you end up covering 1/2 of the card, and then you monitor changes to exposed surfaces of wool strips. If a change occurs, that gives you a sign that you may need to rotate your objects that are on display or adjust the intensity of illumination. We do also have more direct ways of measuring light though, including by using a light meter. These used to be extremely expensive, but actually at this point in time, there are some really good portable versions that are available for under $200. There are also some that function more like data loggers and that you can install within a space to track light over time. Some of these will also include a UV meter so that you can actually measure the proportion of ultraviolet within the visible light. And all of that taken together can give you a great deal of information about the space that you're working with. Controlling the environment in the room as a whole with 24-hour air conditioning and dehumidification is typically the most effective way of protecting an exhibit from seasonal changes. Typically, maintaining 45 to 55% relative humidity is a good goal for materials on display. This is a general benchmark for most furniture, for paintings, paper, textiles, and other objects. Metals can sometimes do better a bit lower at around 35% relative humidity in order to slow corrosion. And you can have certain other materials, again, like high fire ceramics, also most stone and things like that, those are going to be a lot less sensitive to relative humidity, and you may not have to worry quite as much with them. It is good to keep in mind that our human visitors actually add heat and humidity just with their presence in a room. And so this is something that you may have to work with your HVAC systems to really accommodate for. Having a good environmental monitoring program in place will also really help you to have a better understanding of what fluctuations are occurring in your space seasonally, but also potentially during open and closed hours and things like that, which tie back to our visitation. We also want to be really mindful of any air quality issues that are present. So gaseous contaminants are one area to be mindful of. So things like sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, any off-gassing from the cases themselves, all of these can have negative impacts on our materials. And we really want to make sure we're using safe, stable materials inside cases. And ideally, we want to have a good seal on our cases and our framed packages to really prevent this type of contamination. We can also have particulate contaminants, so things like dust and debris. These can damage the surface of our materials. They also can provide an initial food source for all kinds of bacteria and other pests. And so we really want to minimize their presence on our objects as well. So again, ensuring a really good seal on exhibit cases and sealing anything that's framed. Those are going to be great steps to take here. It's also worth keeping in mind that interactions can happen inside of the cases themselves. I remember hearing at a conference where staff from the International Tennis Museum in Rhode Island spoke. And the types of collections they had, they would place metal trophies and tennis balls together frequently within cases. And they discovered that there was a lot of off-gassing that was actually happening from the tennis balls. And that led to really quick oxidation of some of those metal materials. So you always want to be mindful that you can have interactions. And again, if you're condition reporting on a regular basis, you can catch some of these things before they advance too far. Materials are generally going to be best displayed in cases or in frames, although there are certainly exceptions for certain pieces like larger sculptural objects. If we are making our cases out of appropriate material, and if they are properly sealed, then having cases and picture frames can really protect against a wide range of airborne hazards, as well as physical contact by the public. The enclosures can actually also help to reduce the effects of temperature and humidity fluctuations. And while it probably seems obvious, cases should be really easy to open and close, and they need to permit safe installation and removal of our collections too. With our cases, we also want to think about our key policies and any access policies we have for our locked cases. On screen, there's sort of some pros and cons again regarding having open case displays versus sealed cases. Typically with open, you're going to have more issues potentially with visitors trying to touch objects. It will be a little bit more difficult to protect items from dust. You'll probably have more light exposure. Depending on how things are situated, if you have a surprise emergency like a leaky pipe, items may be at a greater risk of impact in that situation as well. And if we have sealed cases, we are typically providing better security for our materials. Microclimates can be positive if we have ensured that they're providing a good temperature and relative humidity for our objects, but sometimes they can be issues as well. You may end up discovering that too much humidity, for instance, is being trapped in the case. So we really need to monitor for that. And with our cases, you can consider whether you really want something where air exchange is happening, which can be very, very important for certain materials, or if we really want to have something that's very tightly sealed. With case materials, you can find a lot of cases that were constructed out of wood, and that's because it's a readily available material. It's pretty easy to work with, and honestly, you can make an exhibit case that looks good using that as a base material. Unfortunately, there are resulting degradation products from the wood itself that pose a great danger for our sensitive materials, including paper, textiles, and things like that. There is a wide variation in the types of wood that can be used, but all wood, even if it's old and well seasoned, it will generate volatile acids. And so you need to be aware of this. And collections of materials should not be placed in direct contact with wood. All wooden surfaces should be covered with barrier materials, such as undyed cotton or linen, or even something as simple as a piece of archival mat board or polyester film can help to provide a barrier. If you're working with cases like this, you might also consider sealing the wood with a moisture-borne polyurethane or a 2-part epoxy sealant, because this can further reduce gaseous emissions. There are some specific barrier materials that you can purchase, things like marble seal, which will also help with that. Marble seal is a really flexible and heat sealable barrier that helps to resist the transmission of oxygen and water vapor. You can find it at all of your general archival suppliers, and it is actually pretty easy to work with. With any of these sealants, though, they can be great steps to take to make your case safer for your objects, but the sealants themselves are also going to need curing time. So if you're using a sealant, allow at least 3 weeks for it to air after application. Other case components like fabric linings and adhesives, even the gaskets that are used to seal the case, we want to choose these with care. Fabrics that are made of silk are going to be acidic. Those that are made of wool will actually emit sulfur compounds, and so neither of those are going to be recommended. Using undyed cotton, linen, polyester, or cotton polyester blends are considered acceptable. And all fabrics should be washed before use so that you are removing any sizing that manufacturers added to the fabric itself. The National Park Service has a really nice conservagram on safe plastics and fabrics for exhibition, and that is included within the resource list that goes along with this webinar. So this is just an example of a really interesting and newer innovation to protect from light damage. And it is a smart glass exhibit case. So this is a case that's been constructed to use 2 different layers of museum quality glass with a layer of film in between them. And the film can switch pretty seamlessly from dark to clear just with the push of a button, or it can be set up to be motion activated. Once it's activated, the glazing will stay clear for a predetermined amount of time that the institution who's installing this would control, and then it can darken to its original state. And the great thing about this is that the glazing blocks 99% of UV light at all times, and when it's dark, it also blocks 98% of visible light. So there's a lot of range in how you can go about protecting your materials, and lots of good innovations that continue to come about. So if we think about considerations in regards to security, that's going to include our display methods. So thinking about whether materials are enclosed in cases, which can reduce the likelihood of visitors touching an object, thinking about the methods of framing or mounting materials that we're choosing. If we are hanging a frame just by putting it on a nail on the wall, that's going to be much less secure than one that we attach to the wall with a T-lock. So being mindful of all those variations. And then factors that relate to your overall space and visitation also have a high impact on security, such as if an exhibition is in a high traffic area. Staffing considerations like stationing security guards or gallery attendants within the exhibit space, those can also greatly impact the overall security of materials on display. Good security practices include using cases that lock securely to prevent theft, as well as, honestly, to prevent foreign objects from being added to the exhibit. So things like gum and pencils sometimes can get added by our visitors. And honestly, occasionally some folks are genuinely trying to add content and might slip in a photograph or something like that that they think goes along with the exhibit. So sometimes it's well-intentioned, but we still want to limit folks' ability to actually get into those cases. Having fire detection and suppression systems, that's also critical and really should be in place in the exhibit area. If we have materials that are especially valuable, whether that is valuable in terms of thinking about financial value, or perhaps they are really intellectually or historically valuable to the institution or collection, then adding another layer of human security, such as having security guards present in the gallery space, or adding recorded surveillance, those are going to be really recommended steps. With the case that we have on screen, this is not 100% ideal. You can see that this case is located too close to a door, but this is a good example of a case. It's a simple case design, but it does have a lock that's integrated into the case itself. And so that part we do like. So if we briefly review our space considerations, some of the key things to keep in mind are that understanding our light levels, that's a really critical piece. Temperature and relative humidity need to be kept as stable as possible within our exhibit spaces and within the cases themselves. Our exhibit case construction and the mount materials that we choose, those all need to be chemically stable. We want to secure our space against loss and damage, whether that is accidental or deliberate. And one that we didn't really talk about in detail, but which is also very important, is that food should not be allowed within these spaces to prevent pests and accidental spills on cases. Having worked not just in preservation, but having also spent, prior to joining NEDCC, 10 years in the museum field, I am very aware that that last point is sometimes difficult to pull off depending on event policies and things like that at your institution. If you cannot prevent all food and drink in an area, you need to at least put certain restrictions in place, right? Let's say no red wine, for instance, nothing that's going to stain and cause major damage. And you certainly need to implement greater housekeeping policies. Any event that has food needs to be cleaned up immediately afterwards. Food needs to be taken off the premises. It should not stay overnight, things like that. Ideally, though, that's just not an issue we're going to deal with because we're not going to allow food into those spaces. So we are going to move on to the next section, which is all about actually putting materials on exhibit. But are there any questions about the topics we've touched on thus far? Okay, so I see Cheryl is asking, is acid-free tissue paper sufficient between a textile and a wood case? So that's a good question. It is certainly a good start. It will definitely help. I would keep an eye on both the tissue and the textile, though, to see if either are exhibiting signs of acid migration from the case. I think ideally having a slightly thicker barrier is going to be better. And again, if you refer to the National Park Service resource that I have included in our list of good tools and resources, you'll see that typically they are recommending materials that are just a little bit more substantial than that, but it's absolutely better than not having anything at all. Okay. I don't see other questions popping up just yet, but please do feel free to continue adding them in chat. All right, so we have discussed many of the risks that are inherent in exhibiting our collections, and we know what kinds of policies we should have in place to help navigate these risks. We understand what we should be looking for in our exhibit spaces, and so now I want us to start thinking about timelines, handling, and our display methods. An exhibit timeline should allow sufficient time for all parties involved to be able to do their jobs and prepare the exhibition. So this means that there is time for curators to develop content, but a good timeline is also going to allow time for new paint or construction materials to off-gas. As with anything that is construction related, we also want to be prepared for things to get a little bit wonky or off schedule, and try to include a buffer in your timeline. The time that you need to really effectively plan for and pull off an exhibition, it's going to vary with the size and complexity of the exhibit, the condition of the materials, any catalog production, and just the size and operating methods of your own individual institution. So we certainly see some places that may prepare for a small exhibit, thinking like a case or two or something like that. That might take just a month for them to put together. Something medium-sized could easily be 6 months, and larger, more complex exhibits often take 3 to 5 years to fully plan and install and open. When we are thinking about the maximum display time for our sensitive materials, if we're thinking about things like our paper materials, our textiles, ideally that is not going to be any longer than 3 months. And that's if our environmental conditions are good. So you really need to keep that in mind, and you may need to develop a rotation schedule for sensitive materials within any longer term exhibits that you have. So that's something to work on, not just from a collections management standpoint, but it's something to chat with your content developers, your curators, whoever is filling that role. Because you may need to consider items, multiple objects that help to tell the same part of one particular story so that you can rotate those textiles or paper items. Our collections will experience a dramatic increase in handling when they are prepared for exhibition and when we're actually installing them. And so we really want to make sure that we're handling everything properly. The first thing to do here is prepare yourself. So you want to remove any jewelry or badges that could come in contact with the item. You'll want to pull your hair back, take care of all sorts of things like that. Following that, you can perform a visual inspection of the object itself before you actually handle it. And when you do this, you want to look for any weak points. You want to remove lids or any other loose elements associated with the main object. You also want to make sure that you have prepared a space for the item before you handle it. So you want to think about where you're actually moving the item to. Is that space clean and clear? Is the route itself clear? The last thing you want when you're moving something big and heavy is just to have a chair in the way, or even an electrical cord or anything like that. You just want everything nicely opened and easy to navigate. And in looking at the object and considering if you can move it safely, we need to think about whether it's really going to fit through that path that's been cleared. Are there other risks associated with moving it? For instance, is it just not stable enough to handle a move? Is it something small and is it a very short move, so you're planning to carry it? Or is this a situation where you need to have a cart? You may also need a second or sometimes even third person to help you actually move the object, especially if it's oddly shaped or heavy. In addition to all of these things, there can be handling restrictions for certain items, such as firearms or other items that can be inherently hazardous, like things that contain lead. So it's a good idea to check your institution's handling guidelines before engaging with any items like that. You may need to wear a lab coat, gloves, a mask, or a respirator, any items like that. The conservagram linked on screen provides some good information regarding certain types of hazards, particularly those found in natural history collections. So before you actually handle an item, you want to consider if you need to wear gloves. We all have oils and salts and dirt and moisture that is on our skin. And of course, as I was just mentioning, sometimes the object's surface can actually be toxic to us. So to be prepared, we need to think about that object. Using clean, dry hands, that will be ideal in situations where tactile sensitivity is needed. It includes situations where you might be handling paper or textiles. Clean, dry hands can also be ideal if wearing gloves could actually pose a risk. So if you think about working with a very heavy or a slippery object, like a really large ceramic or glass sculpture, in that case, having clean, dry hands might actually give you a much better sense of the object itself and much better grip and just be safer. But in general, if you are not sure, then the safest default is going to be to wear gloves. Now, if you are going to wear gloves, we're going to recommend wearing powder-free nitrile gloves rather than cotton, because they are going to fit much more closely to your hands and they allow for improved dexterity as well. When you are handling the material, you always want to use two hands, and you want to support any objects by the body of the object. So this is actually a good example of what you're seeing on screen. You never want to lift an object by a part that may have received a lot of usage during its lifetime. So we're never lifting by handles or straps. We're not lifting furniture by arms or backs. Paintings should not be lifted by frames or hanging hardware, and textiles should not be lifted by their edges. You also want to be very careful to never touch friable surfaces. So things like pastels, anything with flaking paint, anything with chiseled glass. You have to be careful in these situations. You also need to maintain the physical stability of items that you have on view in an exhibition. And so here are a few conservation concerns that you should keep in mind when you are preparing your collections for installation and display. Now, we will discuss mounts in more detail momentarily, but there are some initial things to consider here. All mounts need to be made from stable and appropriate materials. We want the method of support to be sympathetic to the nature of the item. An example of that, again, is having an opening that is set by the book, the needs of the book, not by sort of the ideal viewing perspective. Within cases, we do not want to have items that are in contact with each other, so no overlapping. We really want to prevent acid migration and differential fading. We want to avoid using tacks, staples, nails, tape, blue tack, glue, anything like that to affix items to walls or supports. So based on everything that we just discussed, I would like to open this up to y'all and ask if you see any problems with how this display was put together. And you can use that chat box to type in any issues that you see. So Cheryl is pointing out the layering of the books. Absolutely. And Amy is also mentioning that overlapping, but pointing out that there's also a lack of book cradle for both, but especially for the volume underneath. So I think those are excellent points. Anything else that you all see here? And also the label on top of the book. Yep. So these are the big ones here. Especially since if we look at these materials, we can really tell right off the bat, these are old volumes. They look fragile. And so these are materials that need extra caution, right? We should not have these items stacked on top of each other. We don't want that label sitting on top of the book. Acid migration is going to be an issue here. Light exposure actually is probably an issue here as well. And that lack of cradle is going to cause damage to the bindings. So good job there on IDing the issues at least. All right, so what about in this image? Ooh, so yes, paper clips. Paper clips are a big one. You can see them particularly in this section here. You do not want to see those on the materials. They are going to cause damage. Microclimates, yep, that potentially could be an issue here as well, depending on just the conditions in the space. We're not seeing the full case, so it is possible that maybe they have a data logger tucked in on the other side, but they may not. And then Amy is chiming in with layering again with the labels, and absolutely, you can see in some of these cases, it looks like the label again is directly on top of the object. We don't want to see that. So those are definitely key points to ID. I think last point that I would really mention is here, where it appears that we have some sort of plastic enclosure on this material. Without really seeing it, I can't be 100% sure, but this does not look archival to me at all. And so that's likely actually also causing damage to the material when it's intended to prevent that damage. So how about here? So it looks like we have a few suggestions coming in regarding overlapping again, absolutely. And then yes, the pin or the tack, depending on how you're viewing it, is on its own is absolutely a huge no-no for any original documents. And yet we do see it done. All right, and last one, what about here? Yeah, nice job, folks. So overlapping and tape. Tape is one of the long-standing banes of all collections and archival managers. You can actually see staining on this quite clearly from the tape too, from the adhesive. So not recommended at all. All right, so nice job. And in contrast to some of those problematic images on screen here, we do have a photo of an exhibition at the Morgan Library in New York. And this illustrates a lot of really great practices, including safe locking cases. There are effective book cradles that are displaying volumes at appropriate angles. They've got really nice track lighting. So they're able to provide appropriate conditions there too. There's all sorts of good things on display here. Now, this is also actually really a nice choice for display. And the Morgan Library is going to be a little bit more high end than a lot of institutions can handle, just based on the budget necessary to procure those types of cases and things like that. But in this case, you can see that we have an open book, but that it is supported, and it is just the front cover, whereas other books are being shown closed. Nothing in this case is resting on top of other objects, and being able to close the drawer, that actually really limits light exposure. So this is quite a creative idea here too. All right, so next I want to talk a little bit more about display methods for our bound volumes. All books need to be well supported so that we are protecting their bindings from strain. A closed book that is laid flat on an appropriate barrier material, that's going to be the safest choice, although it probably is not going to be the most exciting to look at. Even so, if we're showing a volume closed, that is less stressful to the book, but the book cover can still be damaged by long-term light exposure. So even closed volumes should be shown for limited periods of time and with appropriate low light levels. If a book is opened or displayed at a gentle angle, having a stand, a mount, or a cradle is going to be critical, and that should provide support to the entire cover of the book as well as to the spine. Most books and all oversized books should be exhibited at no more than a 15-degree angle. It's especially important that books not be propped upright, because that can cause the volume to warp and it can weaken the binding. We also don't want to lay our books out completely flat. So I mentioned this earlier, but a 180-degree angle is not going to be good either. So we really want to be mindful just to open it as much as its binding is going to comfortably allow. And books are going to differ in this respect. So having book cradles that are custom made to fit each volume is going to be ideal. This is something that can certainly be ordered from mount makers or made in-house if you have the staff skill set and the supplies to do so. On screen is an example from Gaylord Archival, although you'll find some very similar systems at other archival vendors as well. And it's a book mount set that includes I think it's 7 separate pieces that you can arrange in various configurations so that you can appropriately cushion rare or damaged books for display. Now, this particular one is made out of a material that's really ideal for short-term support of books. So things that are perhaps being used for research in your reading room. It's soft enough to conform to heavy embossing and embellishments. So it's great for that sort of thing. If you were to use it for exhibit for that longer term period of time, you would want to have a barrier in between your item and the urethane support. When it comes to materials that you can use for mounting our bound volumes, it's probably clear at this point in time that the materials that collections items come into contact with during exhibition, they are a very important consideration, especially from a preservation perspective. And there's a range of different things that can be used. So mat board and paper, acrylic materials, polyethylene, polyester, polycarbonate. There are going to be key characteristics of some of these though. So if we think about things like acrylic, this material is going to be less likely to chip, but it is still less impact resistant than something like polycarbonate. It is less likely to scratch, it's not something that's going to yellow over time. And I think I just said it was less likely to chip, and I apologize. This is actually one that's much more likely to chip. So it's less impact resistant than some of our other options here. If we look at that polycarbonate, this one is going to be really impact and chip resistant, but it is a lot more likely to scratch. It is also actually substantially more expensive than some of the other materials listed on screen, generally about 2 to 3 times more expensive than acrylic. And it can yellow over time due to UV exposure. It is easier to work with though. It cuts relatively easy. It's less likely to break than some of these other materials, particularly acrylic. So there's pros and cons to all of these. If you're creating a support, you also want to think about just what type of flexibility you're designing. Is this something that is just single use for this one specific object? Is it something that is actually adjustable? Think about your goals for the exhibit, but also if this is something that can support other long-term display goals too. You absolutely can fabricate some of these materials in-house. If you do this, just make sure that you're using stable materials that are going to be compatible with the specific artifact you're trying to display. If you have in-house art handling staff or a registrar, they may be good folks with experience with this type of work, and so they may be able to help you with this type of construction. There are also many commercially made molded acrylic cradles and wedges that are available in different sizes and angles from conservation suppliers. And those are going to provide an alternative to a truly custom cradle, but they might work really well for a lot of the materials that you're working with. And at the very least, you can make supports with folded museum board or polyethylene foam wedges. So this is an example that was probably made in-house with museum board or mat board. And there's some good things happening here. You can see how well overall, how well supported the spine is and the covers are. That's a really good thing. I would, in this case, prefer to see that the cover supports actually extend closer to the edge of the book. We do have a bit of a gap here. There are also polyester strips, which are holding the pages down so that it's easy to keep it open. That's a really nice practice, but you do want to be careful not to pull the strips too tight. You do not want those to dig into or even cut the paper. So that's something to be mindful there of as well. And in this image, we have various acrylic supports on display. If we look at the larger manuscript here, you can see that there are supports built in to the bottom of this raked cradle that is more fully supporting the manuscript. And so that's a really nice practice. Even with our plates that are on display, you can see that they have some really nice acrylic mounts here as well. So this has been thoughtfully designed. Those are likely preformed. They're probably not custom, but they've been utilized really well. Turning the pages of a volume every few days will help to protect the text from long-term exposure to light. If there is a title page that needs to be displayed long-term, consider using a copy. You can even print that on an acid-free, lignin-free paper and place that into the volume itself so it looks a little bit more natural. Do a really high quality print in that case, but just try to make sure that there's not too much light exposure occurring on any one page. And even if you are turning the pages periodically, you still need to limit that overall display period. Keeping a book open for long periods, even with good support, can still cause damage to its structure. There are some good things going on here. However, you can see quite clearly that there is not any support at the bottom edge of the book. The spine itself is not being supported, and we don't have those nice little stops built in to the support. So this one's not as ideal. So this is a pretty cool piece that was developed by staff at the MIT Libraries, the conservation lab there. And they worked to create a mount that properly supports books, but that is also flexible and that can be adjusted to use on books of different sizes and to display materials at different angles. So it's called the Vivac Book Cradle. I did link to an article within the slide deck. I included at least, I think, one other link regarding this in the resource document as well. But it's great because in the long run, having flexibility like this, where you can adjust the mount and actually use it to accommodate a range of materials, that can help you to be able to purchase high quality materials because you're purchasing them once and then you're able to reuse them from exhibition to exhibition. So it's just a really nice sample of that. Now, I know sometimes we just can't necessarily afford to immediately acquire some of these types of mounts that I've been covering. And there are also some really inexpensive DIY options that can provide a good deal of support to our bound volumes. And so the example on screen here is using new or used Tyvek envelopes with air pillows tucked inside. So you can set these up pretty easily. There's a how-to video that is linked on screen. If you're going to use this for exhibit, a good idea is to drape a little bit of exhibit-safe cloth over the pillow for a much more finished look. If maybe you're just using this for researchers at a research table, you may decide that the cloth isn't necessary. But this is just a really nice option, very low cost, very DIY and easy to pull off. If we're thinking about documents, so our unbound materials now, we want those to be completely supported by mats and museum quality framing and hinging techniques, or potentially by polyester slings, bands, or cover sheets. And unless we have materials that are matted or encapsulated, our paper items need to be attached to pieces of rag board or other archival material that has been cut slightly larger than the size of the sheet. This will add another barrier between the object and the case. It also provides some support whenever we're moving the object. Paper sheet materials should be attached securely to mounts, and those can be hinged or attached with corner supports. Generally, non-adhesive mounting is going to be preferred because adhesive always has a way of moving over time, and we really want to make sure we're not getting any adhesive on our objects themselves. And there are some commercially available archival paper or plastic photo corners that will actually work on small documents and photographs as well. But most artifacts are going to require the more substantial support that comes from corner straps. And these are pretty easy to make out of either polyester film or woven polyester. Objects can also be encapsulated in polyester film, which helps to protect and support the object during and after the exhibit. But you want to be aware that if positioned vertically, large or heavy objects that are encapsulated in enclosures that have double-sided tape, they can actually slip and they can become embedded in that tape seal. So for this reason, encapsulation should be done with ultrasonic or heat seals. Again, we're really trying to avoid adhesive whenever we can. With framed items, using stable materials is especially important because the objects might actually remain in those frames long after the exhibition is over. The frame's glazing should not come in contact with the object itself. So that's part of what a mat helps to protect from. And using ultraviolet filtering glazing is going to be best. Acrylic glazing is often appropriate for things like pastels. Acrylic glazing is often appropriate for many materials, but for things like pastels and for anything that's friable, you want to make sure that you're using glass because there can be more of a static charge that's generated from acrylic. which we completely want to avoid if we have any delicate material like that. Frames also need to be well sealed and they need to be hung securely. And you want to avoid hanging items in any damp areas like on an uninsulated outside wall, which can be really problematic in winter or during periods of high humidity. So there's a lot of detail that goes into framing. Fortunately, NEDCC has a really great preservation leaflet on matting and framing. Was relatively recently updated as well, and that is something that I included in the resource list for you all to take a look at. Now, here is an example from Archival Products of an exhibit folder on the left and a reinforced L sleeve on the right. And these are good for storage and for display. With the L sleeve, you have options of potentially matting that and then hanging it vertically, or you can prop it up on a raked support, which would look a little something like this. So here we have the supportive board on a raked support. It's a really simple setup, but it can help to provide the type of even support that a document needs when it's being displayed. So we have some issues on display here again. If we're looking at the left-hand side, these are blueprints of some type, and those are going to be extremely light sensitive to the extent that original blueprints actually should never be used in exhibition. Any blueprints, and actually other cyanotypes as well, they are going to be highly acidic. So when you place them in a microenvironment like this frame, you're actually trapping acid next to the paper, and that can lead to increased degradation. So these are materials that need special considerations, and if you are hoping to display something like a blueprint, this is going to be an instance where a really high quality facsimile is going to be the appropriate solution for display. On the right-hand side, we have a whole bunch of unmounted photos that are on the bottom of the case, and you can see how much they've curled over time from that lack of proper mounting and support. Looking at the second shelf down from the top, we can also see an item that clearly has signs of past water damage. And that doesn't look to be particularly well supported. On the top actually as well, there are signs of damage. So this is just an instance where all of these mounts and supportive techniques really need to be reconsidered and refined a bit. Now, this is still pretty simple, but there's a lot of good practices here. So in this particular case, what we're actually seeing are a lot of facsimiles of certain handwritten documents. There also isn't overlapping, particularly where in the middle we have what looks like the one original, which is a clipping in this case instead of an actual handwritten manuscript. But it's a pretty simple setup, but it is showing better practice. Now, most of what we just discussed also applies to three-dimensional objects when we're thinking about appropriate support, appropriate materials to use, and things like that. But I do want to highlight a few special concerns here. So again, just as with books, our objects need to be well supported. And this can be achieved through a range of solutions. On screen are objects from the Peabody Essex Museum's Empresses of China's Forbidden City. So this is a larger institution, a pretty high-end exhibition, and these materials are all being held in place by really beautiful custom-made mounts. You can see how well this mount is following the form of the object. It's providing fantastic support. And even when we're thinking about the shoes that are on display, there's actually some really great internal supports that are helping the shoes to keep their form. So this is a wonderful example, but of course, it doesn't need to be quite this fancy. You do still want to be mindful, though, that you're providing support overall, and you don't want to rely on any original clamps, string, or other materials that are attached to the object to aid in that support. This is very similar to thinking about some of those handling practices we mentioned earlier. So anything that is original to the object and that received a good deal of use during its lifetime, that is actually likely to be a weak spot at this point in time. There are lots of pre-made mounts and risers that are available and of good quality. You can find things like spider mounts from University Products and probably several other archival vendors. And of course, you can also make your own mounts. For instance, using Epifoam to carve a stable cavity mount and then draping it with an exhibit-safe cloth will provide a really polished look for some of the objects that need that type of support. The link that's embedded here on screen is to the National Park Service's Conservagram, all on safe plastics and fabrics for exhibit and storage. Textiles that are in sturdy condition can often be hung. So thinking about things like quilts, carpets, tapestries, and blankets that again are in good condition, those are going to be good candidates for this type of treatment. The link on screen is for the Textile Museum at George Washington University, and they provide some detailed instructions for hanging methods. Now, if you have larger textiles or those that are in less sturdy condition, you need to take additional measures. So those can often be mounted onto a wooden frame called a strainer, over which mounting fabric has been stretched, and then the textile can be sewn to the stretched fabric in a way that is fully reversible, but that provides good support for the textile. However, once you're getting to this level of preparation, this is something that should only be pursued with the help of a trained textiles conservator. This is no longer DIY territory. But alternatively, many textiles can also be safely displayed flat. So there are a lot of good resources on textiles out there. In the resources document, I highlighted some from the National Park Service, from the Canadian Conservation Institute as well. Those are really good starting places for learning a little bit more about display, but also long-term storage of textiles. All right, so I just want to take a few minutes to distill the major points that we've covered in today's session, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So when we're thinking about key exhibition practices, most original materials should never be exhibited permanently because this is a practice that causes irreversible light damage. The potential exceptions to this are going to be high fire ceramics, again, things like porcelain. It may include metals, stone, and glass as well. Even with these materials, though, it is really important to regularly monitor the items for damage because they are, in general, much more resistant to light damage, but you can still find that issues arise with fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity. So there still needs to be that ongoing monitoring, both of the conditions in the space and that continual condition reporting of the objects on display. There are a lot of institutions that avoid exhibiting sensitive original materials by using facsimiles when feasible, and this can be a really good practice to employ. If originals are to be exhibited, then damage from light can be reduced by keeping light levels as low as possible and by limiting the duration of the exhibit. As a very general rule of thumb, original materials should be exhibited for no more than 3 months, and exhibit times may be shorter for extremely light sensitive materials or if your light levels are difficult to control within your exhibit space. So understanding your lighting conditions and the materials that you plan to exhibit are going to help you to make the best possible decisions. Policies are essential, and I hope I made that clear today. I really can't state that enough. In terms of nuts and bolts for your policies, having a basic framework for an exhibition policy for a small to medium-sized institution, that's going to include a commitment to reviewing the condition of the record prior to the exhibition to determine if it's safe to be exhibited, continuing to review the condition to ensure that it is staying safe during exhibit, and taking a close look at it after it comes off of display to evaluate any needs that have arisen during that time. You need to monitor and maintain those light level standards. So when we're thinking about our lux levels, as well as the degree of UV present in the space, you need to monitor and maintain relative humidity and temperature standards in your exhibit area. Establish the potential limits regarding length of time for exhibit, whether we're talking about a temporary or potentially permanent display, just really thinking about what that means. You need to use adequate support for any materials that are being placed on display. Using safe display materials as well. So again, when we're thinking about appropriate plastics and fabrics and things like that, those need to be employed for the cases themselves, for any barrier methods, and for mounts. Again, coming back to that idea of displaying facsimiles or high quality copies where that's possible. Establishing loan and borrowing procedures, and making special arrangements for light sensitive materials, or potentially choosing not to exhibit the original. All of these things should be discussed within that policy. Now we have a much more comprehensive resource list that I've mentioned several times now, but I did add just a couple interesting resources at the end of the slides as well that you might want to check out. The first two are from the Sustainable Heritage Network, and show some really great ways for utilizing commonly available but safe materials to improve exhibition mount and fabrication. The third link is from the National Park Service, again regarding safe materials to use during display, and there is a really nice sample loan document available through AASLH as well. So just a couple that I wanted to highlight that we hadn't talked about as much during this webinar, and then tons and tons more in the full resource document. So that brings us to the end of the session, and I would be happy to answer questions that you all have in the time that we have remaining. So please feel free to type those into chat, or even to unmute if you'd prefer, and ask them that way. And while you are thinking of questions and perhaps typing, I also would love to encourage all of you to just take a few minutes to answer our webinar evaluation form. There's a link on screen, and I'm going to just paste a clickable version into chat for you all. Okay, so that should be in chat now too. And this is something that Sarah will be sharing with folks too after the webinar. But yeah, that's it for me. Thanks so much for attending, and I would love to answer any questions you all have.
Thanks, Stephanie. Like Stephanie said, I will be going ahead and sharing the evaluation form link with you all afterwards, and the recorded session will be on our YouTube. That link will be there, and then the handouts that she provided for you all will also be in that follow-up email within the next couple days. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.